take me back to the beginning when you were still forming the bones of what would become this company. What was happening in the world, and what problem did you think that Anthropic was uniquely poised to solve?
So it's just about to be Anthropic's 5th birthday later this week. And really the way that we got started is my 6 co-founders and I were all working at OpenAI together. And we had worked together on a range of different projects, from scaling up some of the biggest models, so GPT-2 and GPT-3, a lot of the early language work that sort of became part of the LLM revolution, scaling laws work, and then a lot of work really on the technical safety side. So work in interpretability and alignment. And it felt at a certain point like we had this really clear vision of the company that we wanted to build. A technology company, developing transformative AI at the frontier, but with this very intense sort of focus on making the system safe and reliable. And it felt at a certain point like it just made more sense to go do that on our own, which is how Anthropic was founded. And to really set the scene, it was the winter of 2020, beginning of 2021, and so we were all sort of locked in our houses. It was still like peak pandemic, and I think the opportunity felt both very scary and very exciting at that time.
There's this almost cinematic moment that you described in January of 2021, and you're in Dario's backyard. Everyone's wearing masks. Eric Schmidt is there, yes. And you're pitching him, and the pouring rain under a tent. Take me into that moment, and do you see that as almost the origin story of the company, or where in the company's founding does that moment take us?
Yes, that's amazing. So I think that was, I'm going to forget the exact date, but it was like single digits January. I believe we left December 18th, and then single digits January. We're in Dario's backyard, exactly under this sort of, we called it the party tent. We're sort of under this tent that we had put up because it was raining. And then Eric ended up being one of our Series A investors. But it was really, we had kind of done this thing, made this decision. We wanted to go and start this organization, but it was still very early days, and we had really no clear idea yet what exactly that was going to look like. We had a really big dream and big ideas. Another fun fact about that is I was actually 8 weeks pregnant with my son, and I think only Dario knew of all of the co-founders. I'm actually not sure he knew yet. And so I was, it was there was just a lot happening. It was the pandemic. We were all wearing masks. We were, social distancing, but we had this really big dream, this big idea. And there was just a lot going on for all of us, both kind of personally and professionally.
Now, in that moment, not in hindsight, what did you think that OpenAI was getting wrong that made leaving worth the risk?
I think the way I would put it is we really just felt more like we were running towards something than running away from something. And what I mean by that is, the co-founders, we had all sort of known each other for kind of various amounts of time and worked together over a lot longer than just our time at OpenAI. Dario and Chris Olah and Tom Brown had all worked together at Google Brain before OpenAI. Jared was a Hertz fellow with Dario. Obviously, Dario and I are siblings. I'd known Chris for 10 or I just ran into him in the elevator, and I was like, I've known Chris for 13 years, something like that. And so we really had this kind of long history together just as a group of people with this sort of very like-minded set of values, right? We really felt deeply that artificial intelligence had this incredible upside, but that in order to be able to really realize that, we had to take the risks really seriously. And I think, at a certain point, we thought, what if we could just found an organization like this where really this is at the center of everything we do? And I think there was this kind of inherent, belief in there that this is also something that would provide economic value and would also actually be really a selling point, right? That often there's this sort of misbelief that safety and reliability kind of come into tension with the business side, and we actually had this sort of, at the time it sounded very novel, this belief that those two things actually were correlated and that they went together.
And you're the person who has to we take safety seriously into actionable strategies. What's keeping you up at night?
I would say there's kind of two parts, two things that I would say sort of on the safety front. I think one is that there's just a lot of really interesting technical safety work that is sort of still to be discovered. And I think Anthropic has really been the kind of leader in the industry, or tried to be the leader in the industry of doing that kind of work. So this is everything from the work we do in mechanistic interpretability to constitutional AI. And I just think there's so much opportunity, and our technical teams spend a lot of time figuring out like what are the best ways to really build these guardrails into the models directly. And it's just there's always more work to do there, and the models are just getting smart so quickly. And this is something that we've obviously talked a lot about publicly. I think the second is really around just what the impacts of the technology will be on society more widely. And again, I think this is a place Anthropic is a little bit unusual. We publish a lot of really, I think, compelling research about what the societal impacts of artificial intelligence may be. And we published a report recently talking about potential economic impacts of AI and the labor disruption that might come along with that. And the reason I think we try to be as open about this as possible is we really feel it is better to kind of be ahead of potential issues, and that as one of the actors that's sort of developing this technology, it's actually our responsibility as a public benefit corporation to talk about it. And we don't think we alone have the solution, but we do think we need to partner with civil society, with government, with people to talk about what is it going to mean when artificial intelligence is capable of doing so many of the day-to-day tasks that humans can do today.
It does feel like radical transparency is such a core part of your ethos. You mentioned that report, but you also put out data around agentic capabilities and what that means, both in the context of a cyber espionage campaign that originated out of China, where Claude was used, essentially weaponized. But then you also put out research that looked at the fact that when faced with a fatal scenario for Claude, it used blackmail in 96% of scenarios, and other models turned to that as well. And I bring that up in the context of you put it out there, almost as a PSA of this is what the tech is capable of, and here's what we're solving for. So when you were course correcting from both of those examples, what was the most urgent thing on your agenda in order to solve for that?
So I think again, it's like a little bit unusual, right? A lot of people will sort of say, hey, it's a little bit unusual for kind of a company to talk so openly about both the positive upsides, of which we think there are a lot, but also the real world risks and harms that can come from the technology that you're developing. And I think there's a few reasons that we do this. One is, as a public benefit corporation, we really view it as integral to our mission, right? It's important for us as a PBC to say there's a lot of potential upside. We really believe that Claude is going to have the power to literally help cure diseases one day. And in order to realize that potential, we have to get the tough stuff right. And so I think our view is it's actually really advantageous for everybody the more we can talk about the risks, because our goal is to prevent bad things from happening so that we can realize all of these positive benefits. I think the other is that I think just more informed dialogue tends to lead to better outcomes, right? We're very fortunate that we have the access and information to be able to talk about the risks that we are seeing as they emerge. And so we're able to say, hey, Claude can be used as a cyber weapon potentially. This is something we really need to be aware of. And by the way, if this is happening to us, it's probably going to happen to the other frontier model developers. And I think there is a way that in the sort of safety, trust and safety, and security communities, a lot of the work can often transcend the companies, right? It's important to sort of publish these, easy to understand papers about why certain trends are happening in the abuse space with the technology we're developing. And so I think we view that kind of fundamentally as part of our mission. And really thinking about, if you were a technology company maybe of the last era, right? If you were a social media company, for example, if you could have gone back in time and said wow, if we had known what was maybe going to come out of these platforms, would we have done anything differently? And so I think Anthropic is really trying to say, we're trying our best. We can't know the future, of course, but to say, if we thought that X or Y thing might happen, did we do everything we could today to talk about it and to try and mitigate those risks?
I'm looking back the last 6 months, and it's just been tremendous, the amount of compute contracts being signed across the industry. And Gemini, it's in the last 6 months really closed the gap in terms of model performance. But one of the things that analysts point to is the fact that Google owns the entire stack, whether it's chips, the cloud business, the fact that it also has all these different surfaces to deploy their tech. Anthropic is now getting into the business of first-party infrastructure builds, committing $50 billion to creating these data centers in New York and Texas on top of existing cloud commitments. Is that a part of the strategy to win in the AI race? You also need to be an infrastructure builder and own more of that vertical stack?
It's really interesting. I think one of the challenges of operating in the artificial intelligence space is that just the requirements of compute and sort of associated capital are just so high if you want to sort of train a frontier LLM. And I think what we have always aimed to do at Anthropic is be as judicious with the resources that we have, while still operating in this space where it's just a lot of compute, to your point, that you need. And what's interesting is Anthropic has always had a fraction of what our competitors have had in terms of compute and capital, and yet we've pretty consistently had the sort of most powerful, most performant models for the majority of the past several years. And I think that is due to just the quality of our team and also just our orientation, right? Our desire to do more with less, I think, is something that has always been a core value of Anthropic's. And the compute requirements for the future are very large. And so our expectation is, yes, we will need more compute to be able to just stay at the frontier as we get bigger.
I mean, back of the envelope math, roughly 100 billion in compute commitments from Anthropic. Your competitor OpenAI is at $1.4 trillion. Speaking broadly about the industry, are we overspending on compute compared to what we can reliably monetize through LLMs, or is it pretty realistic, the numbers that are being thrown out there in terms of what's necessary to serve the user?
So, it's interesting. A lot of the numbers that are thrown around are sort of not exactly apples to apples because of just how the structure of some of these deals are kind of set up, right? Some of these are sort of, you have the ability to buy the compute and you sort of, have to kind of commit to it early in advance. But I think the sort of fundamental thing that the industry is kind of banking on is this belief that you have to invest upfront very early in order to be able to get access to the hardware that you need to train the models in several years. And so I think if you asked one of my technical colleagues, what they would say is we have continued to be surprised, even as the people who pioneered this belief in scaling laws, right? This idea that more compute leads to better outcomes, that there is just this kind of exponential graph that happens, right? Dario has talked about it from just the performance of the models, the kind of revenue scale that you see every year. But I think it's funny, something that I hear from my colleagues a lot is, the exponential continues until it doesn't, right? And I think in our view, every year we've been like, well, can't possibly be the case that things will continue on the exponential, and then every year it has. So I think it's an interesting question because we can't know the future. It's possible we could be wrong, and what we've seen historically is that every year-over-year performance looks reasonably exponential.
We've been talking a lot about these circular deals in the last few months where you have the model makers and the hardware suppliers and the cloud vendors kind of swapping cash around as part of these deals, whether it's swapping equity for chips, et cetera. What part of that is healthy flywheel behavior, and where do you see red flags?
It's interesting. I obviously can't comment on deals not done at Anthropic or even obviously on the sort of specifics of our deals. But I think what I would say here is that, again, it's not exactly not all deals are created equal. Mm-hmm. And I think there are...
Is a good example the Microsoft and NVIDIA deal?
I think probably, I would say they all vary a reasonable amount, and obviously for legal reasons we sort of can't go into the specifics of them. But I think what I would say is that just the different players have sort of different approaches to how we kind of think about compute and capital in general. And again, I would just point back to, pretty consistently Anthropic has had, again, a fraction of the resources of our competitors, and yet we've been able to do more with less. And I think our hope is that in the future, these model providers will be part of that flywheel that you talked about. I think we're already seeing that as the first LLM to be offered across all three of the major clouds, across Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. And I suspect that there will continue to be a lot of value creation that happens, particularly in the business realm. I think for Anthropic, it's almost a little tautological. We're really focused on businesses first. But a lot of what we've seen is that the demand for these models is actually hard to keep up with. And so at many points over the past year or so, although not all points, we've actually had more demand for Claude than supply to be able to provide it from a compute perspective.
And on the hardware side, how are you thinking about depreciation of some of these chips? Are you underwriting for a 3 or 4 year life cycle, or are you looking at sweating GPUs for up to 10 years for fully available life cycles?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think, I'm not an expert on the chip side. One of my colleagues would probably be able to answer the specifics better. But my sort of high level understanding is that much like the LLMs, where every kind of frontier model is better enough that a high-performing company or individual would prefer to use the newer model, it's pretty similar in the hardware space. And so often, next-generation chips come out and they're just somewhat more performant, somewhat more cost-effective, somewhat more efficient, and that it's often really valuable to be able to access the newer chips.
I'd be remiss not to ask you whether or not we're in an AI bubble. And I don't mean that the technology isn't real, but that the spending curve is outrunning the revenue curve. Do you think we are in a bubble?
So I think I would distinguish between what I would call sort of the technology side and the kind of business or economic side. And I think on the technology side, Anthropic, and I think Dario talked about this publicly recently as well, we feel very strongly that from a pure technological perspective, we do not see progress slowing down. Again, it's impossible to know the future, but based on everything we've seen so far, the models just continue to get better and better, faster and faster at a reasonably predictable rate. I think on the economic side, it's a much more interesting question. Regardless of how good the technology is, it takes time for that to be used in a business or sort of personal context. And I think the real question to me is how quickly can businesses in particular, but also individuals, leverage the technology, right? Maybe, the next Claude model, Claude 5, Claude 6, is the same percentage better as the models before it, but the process of actually rolling that technology out within an organization might hit a wall because of human reasons, right? It's hard, change management takes time. It's hard to do procurement. It's impossible to know exactly all of the use cases up front. And so I think it is an interesting question to think about at what rate will this sort of be disseminated into the economy, and is that going to exactly match the rate that it has to date of how quickly the technology has accelerated?
With that in mind, do you think that we are over-investing either in the model providers or in the hardware supply chain right now?
It's such a small, it's funny to put it this way. The dollar sizes are large, but the actual number of players everywhere is pretty small. And I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. It's like maybe a little bit unusual, but I think that what we've seen so far is returns to better hardware are high. And returns to having even a slightly better model, right, a 0.01 increase is also very high. And we've sort of seen that pretty reliably throughout our history at Anthropic. And so I don't necessarily know if I would say overinvestment, but I certainly think there's something about the sort of limited number of actors, and if something goes wrong in sort of one link in the chain, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about what would happen.
Where do you think we are in that cycle potentially, whether you call it a bubble bursting or just a basic correction in terms of all the froth that we're seeing? Is this something that might be in the 6 to 12 month range? And if so, are you making decisions now to help Anthropic prepare for that kind of downturn?
So again, I think Anthropic ourselves, we view ourselves as continuing to be thoughtful and respectful stewards of capital. And I think that has always kind of been our focus, is every sort of ounce, every dollar of compute is important and represents either the ability to train better, safer models or the ability to serve more customers. And so I like to think that we have reasonably good, although again, impossible to do forecast perfectly, just predictions for what we sort of expect our model quality to look like, how much compute we need to train those models, how much compute we need for inference to serve our customers, and the value that we expect that we'll continue to provide for them. And so my hope is that as a sort of responsible business, regardless of what happens in the market, we would be in a good position. I think it's hard to sort of speak for the wider market, but I think for us personally, again, we've always aimed to be responsible stewards of capital, and I think that will always be our goal.
Let's talk about next steps for Anthropic. Acquisition likely off the table due to a mix of antitrust laws and just the sheer scale of what you've reached. Is an IPO on the cards for 2026?
So obviously we don't have anything specific to share at this time. I think, as I've said, I think Anthropic has always tried to be as responsible as we can with the capital that we have, and we're always balancing and weighing, thinking about where is the best place to sort of access the capital that we need.
Amazon is still your biggest strategic backer, but you've certainly brought new names onto the cap table, whether that's Google as an investor and cloud provider or Microsoft and NVIDIA, as we chatted about. Google is also a rival in the model race. So how do you navigate all of these relationships with big tech when you have partners who have varying ambitions pointing in different directions?
I really think it points to just the intense desire and sort of like need for this technology across the business market, that Anthropic is offered on all three clouds is really interesting, including a competitor, right? And I think it's because, again, I don't know for certain, but my sense is that all of the hyperscalers are also just watching what is happening from a business perspective to their users, right? So the Fortune 500 might be on one cloud, they might be on three clouds, they might be on two clouds, but every one of them now feels like they must have an AI solution. And I think what we've seen is that because of our focus on businesses in particular, we are often the model that customers want to use. And so an inability to sort of access an Anthropic model, a Claude model, is actually just harmful to businesses, right? And so I think our ability to really be available where customers need us has just been a major focus for us, right? This has been a major area to say, if everybody wants to use Claude, they might be able to access us first party, but a lot of customers already have existing relationships with the cloud providers. That's often a really natural way for them to access the LLM market as well.
So from the outset, Anthropic hasn't been as concerned with capturing the cultural zeitgeist in the same way that OpenAI was looking to win over the consumer with ChatGPT. And that singular bet on the enterprise customer clearly has played out to be the smarter bet. You have a lot of people now chasing you on that front, looking to take some of that business. How did you know from the beginning that enterprise was the market to go after?
I mean, I love the credit you're giving us. I wouldn't necessarily say that we knew for sure, but I think Anthropic, I think there were sort of two parts to it. The first is Anthropic as an organization is well suited to be a B2B company, right? We really care about things like reliability and security and safety. That's baked into our DNA, right? Part of why we founded Anthropic was this belief in capturing the upside and sort of mitigating the downside. And it turns out that's something businesses really value. I've never had an enterprise customer say to me, it would be great if you could just get Claude to hallucinate a little bit more or produce more harmful content. And so in a lot of ways, I think I don't want to say lower risk tolerance, but the kind of higher bar for safety in businesses and in enterprises was really well suited to where Anthropic excelled from sort of day one. I think the second was much more kind of an economic theory view, which again, we didn't know, it could have been right, it could have been wrong, was that these models, they are great at entertainment, which is some of what consumers use the models for, but we felt strongly that they looked over time, or they would look over time, a little bit more like, productivity is such a bland way of putting it, but more like tools that help you to do the productive things that humans do, right? Whether that's writing code, which is a very common use case of Claude now, or summarizing very complex information, doing financial or data analysis. I think we sort of, even at the time in late 2020 or early 2021, saw this kind of potential future where Claude was just capable of many of the very kind of high intelligence tasks that humans do in the workplace. And we thought, that's a pretty big market. And so I think when you put those two things together, it just made sense for us to be a business-oriented organization.
Businesses always, I do have an emphasis on safety, but they do always want more features. I imagine they want more agentic capabilities. Is there something that your customers are asking you for that you're just not comfortable giving them yet, given certain safety guardrails that you have in place?
You know, I think what's interesting is we have yet to encounter a really clear use case where sort of safety has come in tension with a feature. I think it's often, there is always some complexity around ensuring that the models are frontier, right? So there have been times where we maybe have a model ready internally, but we need to do more safety testing on it before we release it. And so it's not a direct ask because customers wouldn't necessarily know that. But I think probably the place that we sort of most have that intersection is just making sure that the models we put on the market are as safe as they can possibly be.
When you think about scaling, there are certain decisions that have had to evolve over time. So initially, the company had said that you wouldn't take funding from the Middle East, and then that changed during the most recent funding round. How do you navigate certain principles that you start with at the outset and then having to evolve just to stay competitive in this landscape?
I think in the most important ways, I would say that Anthropic has been fairly consistent in maintaining our values as we have gotten bigger. And I think in particular, the sort of PBC structure, but also the kind of sense of being a public benefit corporation as a North Star has been very powerful for us. And I think that's because, individual cases will sort of come up, and having this kind of vision of like, but are we actually building towards something that is for the common good, right? Are we trying to make the AI transition go well? People might disagree within sort of a range about what that means or what that looks like, but we're very open, with new employees, with recruits, with investors. Like this is who Anthropic is. These are our values. And so I think in general, that's made it pretty easy to navigate the majority of situations, although like you say, there are some that are on the bubble that become more challenging as we get bigger.
Now, one critique that has come up is that this idea of really leaning into a safety mission is that it creates almost this protectable moat where these original labs will be incumbents in the space and it'll be easier for them to stay competitive with regulation instead of startups that are, coming in on the back foot, having not had the same kind of, run up into this industry. What do you say to that?
It's interesting because I believe, I don't have the exact stats in front of me, but I believe a very high percentage of startups actually are Claude users. And so what's interesting is there's a way in which the kind of frontier model development is, I would say, much more gated or kind of moated by the compute and capital requirements that we talked about earlier, right? It's just very expensive to become a frontier lab. But I think what we have seen at Anthropic is that there's actually this flourishing ecosystem of startups that are what we call AI natives. So in the same way that maybe 5 or 10 years ago you would have a digital native business, there are now AI native businesses where really the entirety of their product is built around artificial intelligence capabilities. And the vast majority of these companies are built on Claude. And so I really think our ability to kind of influence this ecosystem is kind of predicated on our ability to build the kind of best, safest models in the industry.
Safety is not exactly a popular posture in Washington, D.C. right now. There was, some crosstalk with David Sachs a month ago. Dario put out an essay in response to that. How do you navigate that political reality without letting it distort the work?
I really think Anthropic has always aimed to be focused on policy instead of politics. And really what I mean by that is we have found, common ground really across the aisle on topics that I believe, the American people care about, right? And this is everything from maintaining AI dominance in the world to ensuring that the models that we develop are good for people, right? Are good for children, are good for adults that use the models. And I think there's quite a lot of common ground actually that you can find. But I think, most importantly, artificial intelligence is such a new space. And so we always aim to be open-minded and curious about the best ways to develop the technology, safely in a secure fashion. We're always aiming to learn here, and this is again part of why we publish so much of our research.
How do you think about effective altruism now? Because I know it's a label that you said that you feel is dated, is not a part of the current narrative of the company, but it was a part of your, founding story in terms of your early hires, in terms of financing. How is that still a part of the cultural movement internally, or or do you think about it at all, or is it just is it something that's being projected onto Anthropic now in 2025?
I think projection is probably like the closer term that I would use for it. I think Dario has talked about this before, but there's a way in which like very, very early on in AI, like in sort of the early 2010s, there just were not a lot of people who were really seriously contemplating that AI could be as powerful as it was. And I think that was fairly overlapping with people who were very concerned about the risks at the time. And so I think, early OpenAI and some of the folks who became, part of early Anthropic were focused on risks, right? We were concerned about what could go wrong with the technology. But I think the biggest kind of differentiator with Anthropic is we're also very focused on the upsides and the benefits. And so I think a lot of how we think about the tech, again, is there is this incredible potential, right, for what artificial intelligence can do for medicine, for life sciences, for healthcare, for financial services, right, for so many different sectors of the economy. And fundamentally, there are a lot of things that can go wrong if we don't build it safely.
There is this mystique almost that clings to Anthropic and the brand. And I don't know exactly how to describe it. And it seems like the people within the company almost feel as though it's a belief system. How would you describe the culture of being an Anthropic employee and the company that you've created and this, and also there's, I think you have become more public in the last few months, but I feel like you guys are typically, you hold your cards close to the vest and you're more private until you're really ready to announce that something's ready to go.
Well, it's very kind of you to say. I don't know about mystique, but that's a very nice sentiment. I think Anthropic fundamentally, one of the values and the things that we talk about a lot internally is just how not to believe the hype. And it sounds like a sort of small thing, but I actually think it goes back to some of the questions we were asking around just economics, right? And I think for us, it's never been about, seeking attention or sort of being in the headlines. We're really here to do the work. And I mean that from a model training perspective. So how do we, train these models in a good, fair, responsible way? But also how do we show up for our customers every day, right? And I think there's a lot of hype in AI right now. And there's something about being an enterprise, business to business focused, oriented is not a word, oriented company that makes us, I think, just a little bit more just like grounded, right? Where we're like, we actually are here to provide value for businesses. And that work is extremely important. Often not as flashy, but I think helps us just sort of not buy into the hype and really be focused on like why we started the company in the first place, right? We're a public benefit corporation. We care about providing value for our customers. And I think it can be very easy to get distracted if that's not sort of your North Star.
Jan LeCun and other members of the machine learning old guard say that LLMs are not going to get us to AGI. He's venturing into world models. He says that he and others say that there are breakthroughs that still have yet to happen in order to get us to that next stage. What do you think? What is the breakthrough that you think that you need to be the big unlock to AGI? Do you think that you're going to have to diversify beyond LLMs to stay competitive as the AI industry evolves?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think AGI is such a funny term because I think, Dario's also talked about this, but like many years ago, it was kind of a useful concept to say, when will artificial intelligence be as capable as a human? And what's interesting is by some definitions of that, we've already surpassed that, right? It's like Claude can definitely write code better than me. It's a low bar, but Claude can also write code about as well as many developers at Anthropic now. Or it can write a percentage of code as well as developers at Anthropic. That's crazy. We probably employ, some of the best, engineers and developers in the world. And many of them are saying, wow, Claude is capable of doing a lot of work that I can do or extremely accelerating the work that I can do. And so I think this kind of concept of AGI alone is complicated. And then on the other hand, you're like, but also Claude still can't do a lot of things that humans can do, right? And so I think maybe the sort of construct itself is now wrong, or maybe not wrong, but just outdated. But I think this kind of question of will we get to just higher level, more powerful, transformative artificial intelligence without other, breakthroughs? And I think the truth is, like, we don't know, right? The path to developing the technology is predicated on a lot of complicated, a mixture of science and engineering. And part of what I think is so special about these lab environments is that it's just like different approaches to kind of getting to that target. But I expect that the progress doesn't seem to be slowing down. Again, nothing slows down until it does, so it's very possible that could happen. And I think if I were betting, I would say probably things are going to at least continue to get somewhat more capable over time, and we should sort of be prepared for a world where that's true.
You and Dario have such different skill sets. Where are you strong that a technical founder is not, and where do you help Dario? How do you help him get sharper?
Yeah. It is genuinely a privilege to get to run Anthropic with my sibling. It's like we have such a special relationship because we've known each other our whole lives, or my whole life at least. He had 4 years without me, poor guy. But I think Dario has this just one-of-a-kind ability to almost, I keep saying no one will know the future. Dario is probably the person who can kind of see the future the best. And I think especially from a technical perspective, has just historically had such incredibly strong instincts about where the technology is going, what it will mean for people, what it will mean for organizations. And he's, I think, like, has truly visionary leadership style there. I'm very practical, so I really love running the organization. I spend most of my time with the senior leadership team, so hiring the people that run the business, thinking a lot about what it means to be a customer of Anthropic. How do we really meet businesses where they are? How do we provide value for them? How do we build the partnerships that are needed to help us, be a sustainable business? And I think, Dario and I really help each other. I think he's great at pushing me to think about the big picture, and I like to think I am helpful in thinking about, like, how do we build an organization that is enduring, that's sustainable, that's filled with great people who really want to do the type of work that we set out to do 5 years ago together.
Great, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Amazing, thank you.